Hey everyone, Tin Man here, and today was a big balance patch for Dota Underlords. There's a whole lot to cover, so let's jump right in. First batch here are quality of life and bug fixes. There's a couple that are notable. The new opponent selection logic. This addressed community feedback over fighting the same opponent over and over again. I know that was a big complaint that a lot of people had, was that you'd face the first place person over and over again, whereas never facing, say, the third or fourth place opponent. So hopefully that should eliminate some of those concerns. Also, classified under bug fix, troll global item coordinated assault now stacks. That's pretty impactful since I know trolls were always a little bit underwhelming. Back in Dota Auto Chess, they were one of, if not the best, mid to late game DPS synergy, and they never really lived up to it here, so hopefully this can give them a little bit of buff. Moving on, they've got Dragon Alliance. So this is one of the big things in this patch, is that the Dragon Alliance has been reworked. It now only requires 2 units instead of 3, and unlocks an additional ability rather than letting them start with 100% mana. So this is very important, as if anybody who's watched my composition video before this knows that the number of units required for an alliance is very, very important in determining how that alliance can fit into other alliances and in different compositions. So the fact that this gets reduced from 3 units down to 2 means we'll see dragons in a lot more different builds and interesting combinations rather than just always being paired up with knights like they were before. Moving on to the Dragon Knight buff, or rework, I guess. He now has Breathe Fire as his base ability, which is a pretty simple AoE effect, and the Dragon Alliance now unlocks the Dragon form, which we know and love. He also got a little bit buff to his hit points, up from 800 to 1000 at level 1, and gained some health regeneration. So these are definitely much needed buffs. He's supposed to be the main carry of dragon compositions, but he's not always been that great. His damage was just too low to carry an entire team that was built around protecting him. The HP and regen buffs here did not really address that issue. I guess they make some sense since he's intended to be on the back line, while the other knights and the knight bonus are intended to be on the front line. Still, his main problem was low DPS, not survivability. So we'll see if this Breathe Fire plus the dragon form can make up for that. My gut says that Dragon Knight will be incredibly strong after this patch. The increased flexibility of dragons plus the changes to knights that we're going to talk about in a moment really should propel him to the top of the meta. The other dragons also got adjusted. Puck and Viper have new abilities. Their baseline ability has stayed the same, but Puck now has Phase Shift, which basically says that whenever Puck would take damage on a cooldown of 6 seconds at 1 star, 4 seconds on 2 star, and 2 seconds at 3 star, Puck will phase out temporarily for about half a second and then phase back in, basically dodging that damage, that auto attack or that ability, whatever would hit Puck. So it makes Puck a lot more survivable. Viper also has a passive defensive ability, Corrosive Skin. Now any opponents who attack Viper have a damage over time applied to them, and they'll have their attack speed slowed. So both of these make Puck and Viper a lot more resilient. So that's always good to see, as they were kind of lower tier before this. Pocket Sand, one of my favorite named abilities or items in the game. Now will also slow mana gain received by 50% and will debuff a random enemy if nobody's right next to where they land. So this is a great buff to assassins. I thought after the last patch that assassins were going to be a decent bit better based on the targeting and movement mechanics, and that didn't really play out. They were still a little bit underwhelming. So a buff to their global item should help, but I don't know. I am a little concerned about buffing global items to buff an entire strategy, because it creates just more feast and famine games, right? If you get the item, you do great, if it's a good item. And if you don't get the item, then you lose with an underpowered strategy. I suppose that's kind of on brand for assassins, though. You know, their gameplay pattern in Underlords has always been that way to some extent. I can see nerfing the strategy by nerfing the item, since it takes down their max power level, which is typically the problem when you want to nerf something. But when you want to buff, you want to increase their worst case scenario, kind of increase the baseline power rather than bring down the top. So I like buffing units and nerfing items, if that makes sense. But we'll see how this plays out. The actual changes are nice. I definitely like the reduction of mana gain, because it helps assassins fight, actually jump in the back line and kill the targets rather than the targets casting their spells and killing the assassins. So next up, mages, or rather Keeper of the Light, the Key Mage. Illuminate, which is his ability, now costs 150 mana. and his health is decreased. So this one's really interesting. Up to this point, every unit in Underlords and even in Dota Auto Chess had their ability cast at 100 mana, and every unit gained mana based on the same formula. Now we have a unit that casts at 150 mana, which has always been theoretically possible, but we've never seen it in action until now. On a surface level, this means that he'll cast his spell later than normal, giving opponents more time to fight. This is great considering how dominant mages are, and Keeper of the Light specifically, how dominant they were at the highest levels of play. I'm really curious to see how they use this adjustment of mana going forward to balance different units. Personally, I hope they use it a lot. It's a very elegant solution to balancing, besides just adjusting health and attack damage. Next up, Desperate Measures. Desperate Measures now also increases mana gained on receiving and dealing damage by the same amount as attack damage. So this is the global item that increases your attack damage, and now mana gain, based on how much health you have missing. And I always thought this global item was pretty strong. When you're low on life, it can increase up to a 19% increased attack damage, and now mana and mana gain. In any case, I think it's a lot more valuable, and I think it's going to be very strong once again, and maybe it can better compete with some of the other units, or some of the other items on its tier. Wicked Intent now blocks HP regeneration. So this item's interesting. It was definitely a weak item when it just reduced healing. Arguably, it's still quite weak since HP regen is not very common outside of the scrappy/inventor compositions. I would argue it should be weak though, or rather it should be niche, since the Heartless Alliance is generally strong against any opponent, so it's a good counterbalance to have their global item be a little bit more niche and a little bit weaker if the baseline alliance is so strong and so generally applicable. Next up, Scrappy Alliance. Now provides 8 armor and 9 health regen. Provides double that amount if your starting army is smaller in size than your opponent's. So it seems like they're adjusting Scrappy to take away some of its dominant early game power. Scrappy units should always be best when they're like underdogs and outnumbered, hence the name Scrappy. So it definitely fits the flavor. The health regen is about what it used to be. I think they used to get 10 health regeneration, now it's 9. But the armor is about half of what it used to be. It used to be 15 and now down to 8. So that means when you're outnumbered, you'll have a bit more health regen, but your armor is about the same as it was before. I think this is great balancing. Scrappy was always too strong early and always worthless in the late game unless you got to the 6 Scrappy bonus, and even then it was just okay. This buff directly cuts into the early power by forcing you to stay underleveled to get the empowered effect, or you just take the weaker version. By the late game, you can almost assuredly stay underleveled, making it a touch more powerful when you get all 6. It also fits because you want to stay lower in the early game to potentially increase the odds of getting those 1 and 2 cost Scrappy units. So overall, I think this is a pretty great change. The next rework was the Knights Alliance, which was desperately in need of a buff or rework, as they were definitely one of the weakest major alliances. It's a substantial buff. They previously only had 20, 35, 50% reduction. Now it goes up to a total of 35, 50, 65 when adjacent. So even whenever your guy runs out of the way or somebody gets killed off, you'll still have some baseline level of reduction. I think we'll start to see more Knights for sure, and specifically Dragonite after this update in the very near future, as they were always a little bit weak, and now hopefully this can get them up to a competitive level. Next up, Chaos Knight. He got a little bit of a buff in his damage, and increased by, actually it's more than a little bit, it's quite substantial, about a 15 average increase. Seems a little random to me, despite the fact that I know randomness is Chaos Knight is his thing. Chaos Knight was already pretty reasonable. I guess they buffed Omni Knight and Abaddon last patch, so maybe they felt like Chaos Knight was lagging behind. I'm not entirely sure since I didn't play a ton of Knights this past patch because they were pretty weak. But in any case, any buffed Knights is welcome at this moment. They have 2 new items now. Boots of Speed, replacing the... Tranquil Boots is now replacing Boots of Speed. It now has that bonus movement speed, but also has a passive 16 health regeneration. So Boots of Speed were pretty much worthless, and the movement speed is still not that valuable. 16 health regen isn't the greatest though, since it needs to survive for 16 seconds-ish to be more useful than a vitality booster. That's simply not realistic in most fights. So I think it'll still be a lower priority item, but it won't be completely garbage like Boots of Speed were. There's also a new item in Tier 4, Pipe of Insight, which has plus 50% magic resistance, and once the first enemy has 100% mana, you apply a shield that blocks 400 magic damage to all allies up to 1 cell away, once per battle. So just in case the changes to Keeper of Light were not enough to weaken mages, they added another item. Just like Hood of Defiance or BKB, this item is amazing against mage compositions, saving your whole board from a spell or two. However, unlike Hood of Defiance or BKB, it's actually quite decent against non-mages as well. A lot of the other compositions deal AoE magic damage, and this can help mitigate that. Something like Kunkka's Boat, Windranger's Power Shot, even Shadow Fiend's and Morphling's ability will deal 1 burst of AoE damage. Maybe it's not enough that you want a Hood of Defiance or BKB, but a 400 magic shield to most of your team will help to mitigate those effects a lot. It's on Tier 4 though, as I mentioned. It's not here in the patch notes, but I checked it in game. It's on Tier 4, which means it competes with a lot of other really powerful items. So I'm not terribly interested in picking it up all the time compared to things like Moonshard or Daedalus. And last note, mobile fixed Australia mode. This is a reference to, I guess, on Android devices the game was upside down. So that's I appreciate their dedication to Australia memes. So that's it. I think it's a great patch, nerfing the OP mages in very creative ways with a new item and also reworking some of the weaker alliances, the Knight alliances plus the Dragons. So I'm really excited to see how this new meta unfolds. I'm especially excited to see where dragons fit in to different strategies. If you enjoyed this patch note review, please do drop a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and you can stay up to date with all my awesome Dota Underlord content coming up soon. Thanks for watching.